Every water-cooled PC needs this little part right here, a coolant temperature sensor. Now look, you don't actually need this little part to get your water-cooled PC up and running, but as far as I'm concerned, this is easily the best $15 you could ever spend on a water-cooled gaming PC. It's the most logical way to set up your fan curves, and it overcomes the big problem of trying to control a simple fan curve for both your CPU and GPU. I've got one installed in my new water-cooled system right here, and today I want to make a full video kind of going over how to set it up and some other things that you need to know. Now these coolant temperature sensors are not a new piece of hardware, but they are pretty new to me, and after using it in my recent build, I'll definitely be using them in all of my water-cooled PCs moving forward. Also, this is similar to how Corsair controls the fan curve in the Corsair One, a compact pre-built where both the CPU and GPU have separate all-in-one liquid coolers. There, both of those coolers have their own built-in liquid thermal sensor, and the single top fan would then spin up if either of those two sensors started warming up. And that's basically what I've done here with my recent build in the Ncase M1, which has two 240mm radiators and four 120mm fans reading from one single sensor. So let me start off just by showing you this graph here to explain why this is so important. So this is the 12-core Ryzen 5900X running Cinebench R20, but only executing on a single processing thread. The result is that one of the CPU chiplets warms up to around 70 degrees C with a few peaks as high as 78, but the other one is basically idling just above 40 C. With a default fan curve setup, the radiator fans here would ramp up to cool the CPU, but that would be kind of pointless because the CPU isn't actually putting any significant heat into the loop. You can see this because the coolant temperature actually doesn't change throughout the whole course of this benchmark. And this actually represents fairly common scenarios and interactions with your system. Those lighter threaded workloads such as adding an effect in Photoshop or in an editing program, or even those multi-threaded programs that do get the CPU quite warm but only last a few seconds. Those events don't actually require your fans to ramp up. With a default fan curve though, that's what would happen. I guess the big message here is that the fans in your custom loop don't directly cool your CPU or GPU silicon. They cool the radiator fans that then cool the liquid that then cools those processors. So having the fans react to the coolant temperature instead of the temperature of your CPU means that your fans will no longer need to ramp up when they don't need to. The result is a much more pleasing system to have around with a much smoother fan curve, most of the time staying really quiet and only ramping up when the fans actually need to. And a coolant temperature sensor also overcomes one of the bigger but more trivial problems of a custom loop, and that's how do you control the fans based off of both CPU and GPU temperature. As far as I know, there's no motherboard BIOS out there that lets you control the fan curve based off of a GPU temperature as the temperature source, but you can get around this with third-party software, but the solution just still isn't as elegant as a single temperature sensor to control both the CPU and GPU. Now you can find these temperature sensors from a few different brands out there, but the one that I recommend and the one that I'm using is from Watercooled, and it's simply in the form of a small G1/4 extender fitting. I've got it plugged into the outlet of my bottom radiator since I found that the most convenient, but anywhere in your loop should be just fine. The temperature sensor itself is plugged directly into my motherboard, which is the Asus X570 Crosshair 8 Impact, but there are plenty of other boards on the market which do have that 2-pin temperature sensor. If your board doesn't happen to have one though, you'll definitely need to use an external hub, but at that point you're just adding more potentially unnecessary hardware to your loop. One such board that I can recommend that does have this 2-pin temperature sensor header is the B550 iStrix from Asus, and as you'll see, configuring this as the temperature source in Asus's AI Suite 3 software is probably the most streamlined way to go about this. So the first step in setting this all up is just finding the total range of the thermal sensor. What temperature does the coolant sit at when the system is at idle, and how warm does it get when your system is at full load, so in-game after a sustained period. If you have the sensor plugged directly into your motherboard like I have, you'll be able to use hardware info to log the activity of the sensor over time. For example, for my system, I observed a coolant temperature sensor range between 30 degrees C and 53. 53. Those cooler temperatures are for idle and light use throughout the day, and then the hottest I've seen it ever get is 53 while playing more demanding titles at 4K after a while. Now of course, room ambient temperature plays a big factor here as well, so different climates are definitely something to consider. My room usually sits between 20 and 23 degrees C. So then the idea is to set your fan curve within this range. I'm using ASUS's AI Suite 3 to set the fan curve here for my ASUS motherboard, but you can also do this in the BIOS for some MSI and Gigabyte motherboards, but not sure about ASRock. So it is going to change between board to board, but like I said, this is probably the most streamlined way that I can recommend doing it. There's nothing that you need to enable once you boot your PC, and once it's set, everything is set and ready to go. So here's what the fan curve looks like for my setup. So for example, with the side radiator fans, I've got the thermal sensor selected as the only source, and I've set the fan curve between a coolant temperature of 35 and 48 C. At the low end, the fans sit at just 500 RPM, and then at the top end, they spin at 1500 RPM. Very similar fan curve for the bottom radiator fans, although these ones top out at 1300 RPM, seeing as they're a bit louder, and also at 53 degrees C. Then for the DDC pump, I've got it running between 1200 RPM at the low end and 3000 RPM at the high end. As you can probably see, there's no black and white way to do this. It really does come down to your preferences and what noise levels you find your system acceptable at. So like I said, for 15 bucks, this thing is an absolute no-brainer, and I'm definitely gonna get my hands on a few more and definitely include them in a few more water-cooled builds moving forward. If you're interested, I will leave it linked down below in the description. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.